December 26, 1944. If General George Smith Patton hadn't reached Bastogne that day, 10,000 United States soldiers would have been wiped out, not captured, not forced to surrender. Wipe out. The men of the 101st Airborne Division were freezing, starving, and down to their last bullets. They had fought like lions for 7 days, but the noose was tightening. German panzer divisions circled them like wolves, closing in for the kill. The man racing to save them was George Smith Patton, the general they called Old Blood and Guts. They gave him that nickname because while other commanders directed battles from comfortable headquarters miles behind the lines, Patton charged into the fire with his troops. His pearl-handled pistols weren't just for show. He'd earned that name through years of leading from the front, through blood and mud and death. But this mission was different. This was impossible. Winston Churchill sat in his London office, smoking his cigar, waiting for news from the Ardennes. The entire Western Front was collapsing. Adolf Hitler had launched his most desperate gamble, a massive surprise attack through the Belgian forests. 200,000 German soldiers, 1,000 tanks, the largest German offensive since the war began. The goal was simple: split the Allied armies, capture the port of Antwerp, and destroy the British and United States forces before they could recover. And Bastogne was the key to everything. This small Belgian town sat at the crossroads of 7 major roads. Whoever controlled Bastogne controlled the movement of armies across Belgium. The Germans needed it. The 101st Airborne held it. Barely. For the United States of America, this was more than a military crisis. American prestige hung in the balance. If Bastogne fell, if those paratroopers were slaughtered, the world would question whether the United States could stand against German military might. Morale would shatter. Families back home would lose faith. The war could drag on for years, but Old Blood and Guts was about to change history. The 19th of December, 1944. 3 days after the German offensive began, Supreme Allied Commander General Dwight David Eisenhower called an emergency meeting at Verdun, France. The mood was grim. Snow fell outside. Inside, generals hunched over maps, their faces drawn with worry. The German breakthrough was catastrophic. Entire United States divisions had been overrun. The front line had dissolved into chaos. British Field Marshal Bernard Law Montgomery suggested pulling back, consolidating, waiting for spring. "We need time to reorganize," he said carefully. "Perhaps several weeks to mount a proper counteroffensive." Other generals nodded. The situation seemed hopeless. Then Eisenhower turned to George Smith Patton. "George," Eisenhower said quietly, "the 101st is surrounded at Bastogne. They're cut off. No supplies, no reinforcements. They can't hold much longer. How soon can you attack north and relieve them?" Every general in that room knew Patton's Third Army was 90 miles away, fighting a completely different battle on a completely different front. To swing that entire army north, through winter storms, across destroyed roads, reorganizing supply lines, redirecting hundreds of thousands of troops and thousands of vehicles, military textbooks said it would take weeks, maybe months. George Smith Patton didn't hesitate. On the 22nd of December, the 4th Armored Division attacks north. "I stake my reputation on it." Silence filled the room. 3 days? One general whispered. "That's impossible." Old Blood and Guts smiled that fierce predatory smile his enemies feared. "I've already done the planning. My staff has 3 operations ready. I can attack with 3 divisions in 72 hours. Give me the word." British generals exchanged skeptical glances. Montgomery's face showed clear doubt. Even Eisenhower looked uncertain. No army in history had executed such a massive maneuver so quickly. Not Napoleon, not Caesar, no one. But George Smith Patton wasn't just anyone. "The Third Army of the United States will turn 90 degrees north," Patton continued, his voice filled with absolute confidence. "We'll punch through German lines, drive straight to Bastogne, and smash that siege wide open. Those paratroopers won't surrender. Not while Old Blood and Guts is coming." Eisenhower studied his most aggressive general. "George, if you fail, I won't fail." Patton's eyes burned with intensity. "Give me those boys in Bastogne, and I'll hand you a victory that'll make headlines around the world." Eisenhower made his decision. Do it. As generals filed out, whispering about the impossible task Patton had promised, Old Blood and Guts was already on the phone to his headquarters. The greatest military maneuver of World War II was about to begin. But could he really pull it off? The next 72 hours would tell. The 20th of December, 1944. George Smith Patton stood in his Third Army headquarters. Maps spread before him like battle plans from ancient Rome. His staff officers scrambled to execute orders that would make military history or end in catastrophic failure. The challenge was staggering. Patton had to move the Third Army, 133,000 soldiers, tens of thousands of vehicles, hundreds of tanks, mountains of ammunition and supplies from their current positions facing east to new positions facing north, through a blizzard, on icy roads, while maintaining combat readiness, while keeping the movement secret from German intelligence, and he had to do it in 3 days. Impossible, said captured German officers later. We thought it would take the Americans 2 weeks minimum, probably a month. What General Patton accomplished violated every principle of military logistics. But Old Blood and Guts had prepared for this moment his entire career. At Bastogne, conditions grew desperate. The surrounded paratroopers of the 101st Airborne huddled in frozen foxholes. German artillery pounded them day and night. Supplies ran critically low. Ammunition, medical supplies, food. The wounded lay in makeshift aid stations, bleeding through bandages that couldn't be replaced. When German commanders sent surrender demands, Brigadier General Anthony Clement McAuliffe sent back one word: nuts. The paratroopers held. But they couldn't hold forever. The 21st of December arrived with worse news. The weather turned brutal. Snow fell in thick sheets. Visibility dropped to zero. Roads became ice rivers. Vehicles slid into ditches. The blizzard that meteorologists said would last days had arrived right on schedule, nature itself fighting against George Smith Patton. Other generals would have delayed, waited for better conditions, requested more time, not Old Blood and Guts. The weather favors audacity, Patton told his staff. The Germans think we can't move in this storm. That means they won't expect us. We attack as planned. Patton drove through the blizzard personally, visiting units, checking progress, inspiring troops. His jeep slid on ice, but he pressed forward. Soldiers saw their commanding general out in the storm with them, not safe in some warm headquarters, and they pushed harder. That's why they called him Old Blood and Guts. He shared every hardship, every danger. By the 22nd of December, 1944, the impossible had happened. The Third Army had completed its pivot. Divisions stood poised to attack north. Supply lines had been reorganized, communications established. In 72 hours, George Smith Patton had repositioned an entire army. Military historians still study this maneuver today. Modern computerized logistics couldn't improve on what Patton accomplished with paper maps and telephone lines. It was genius. Pure military genius. At 4:30 in the morning, the artillery barrage began. Hundreds of United States guns opened fire simultaneously. The ground shook. The sky lit up with muzzle flashes despite the snowstorm. Then the tanks rolled forward, the 4th Armored Division, spearheading straight north toward Bastogne. The German defenders were stunned. Where did these Americans come from? One German commander radioed. We thought Patton's army was 90 miles south. Old Blood and Guts had achieved complete surprise. His greatest weapon wasn't his tanks or artillery. It was speed, aggression, the willingness to attempt what everyone else called impossible. But the fighting was brutal. Every mile cost blood. German units, recovering from their shock, fought back with desperate ferocity. They knew if Bastogne was relieved, their entire offensive would collapse. Panzer tanks engaged Sherman tanks in point-blank duels through the snow. Infantry clashed in frozen forests. Villages changed hands 3 times in a single day. George Smith Patton drove forward to the front lines, standing in his jeep, urging his troops onward. Shells exploded nearby. Staff officers begged him to take cover. He refused. How can I ask these men to advance if I'm hiding in the rear? That was Old Blood and Guts, leading by example, always at the tip of the spear. The 4th Armored Division pushed through the German lines like a steel wedge. 20 miles. 30 miles. Casualties mounted, but the advance continued. Behind them, more United States divisions flooded north, widening the corridor, protecting the flanks. At Bastogne, the paratroopers heard the artillery to the south. They knew what it meant. Patton was coming. Old Blood and Guts was coming. They just had to hold a little longer. December 26, 1944, 4:50 in the afternoon, Lieutenant Charles Bogus of the 37th Tank Battalion, 4th Armored Division, stood in the turret of his Sherman tank on the outskirts of Bastogne. Through the snow and smoke, he saw figures running toward him. American paratroopers. The siege was broken. "Come on in," a paratrooper shouted, grinning despite frostbite and exhaustion. "We've been waiting for you." The relief of Bastogne was complete. George Smith Patton had done the impossible. News flashed across Allied headquarters. Eisenhower received the message and closed his eyes in relief. "Patton did it," he whispered. "Old blood and guts actually did it." At Supreme Headquarters, staff officers who'd called the mission impossible now scrambled to document the achievement. The Third Army had moved over 100 miles in terrible weather, fought through determined German resistance, and relieved a besieged garrison, all in exactly the time frame George Smith Patton promised. No army in history had accomplished anything comparable. In Bastogne, the link-up brought tears to hardened soldiers. The wounded could be evacuated. Supplies poured in: hot food, ammunition, medical care. The paratroopers had held for 7 days against overwhelming odds because they knew Patton was coming. Their faith in old blood and guts had been justified. But the battle wasn't over. German forces launched furious counterattacks, desperate to cut the corridor and re-isolate Bastogne. For days, savage fighting raged. Patton threw more divisions into the battle, widening the salient, securing the supply route, pushing German forces back. "Every time we think we've stopped them, Patton hits us somewhere else," a captured German colonel admitted. "He doesn't give us time to recover. It's relentless. He's like a machine that never stops attacking." That was the Patton method. Constant pressure. Never let the enemy rest. Attack, attack, attack. While other generals planned cautious operations, old blood and guts kept hitting the Germans before they could reorganize. By early January 1945, the German offensive had completely collapsed. Hitler's grand gamble had failed. The Battle of the Bulge, the largest battle the United States Army fought in World War II, was won, and everyone knew who'd turned the tide. The phone rang in Patton's headquarters. It was Eisenhower. "George," Eisenhower said, his voice thick with emotion, "what you accomplished was extraordinary. I want you to know I never doubted you." Patton smiled. Both men knew that wasn't quite true. Everyone had doubted. But old blood and guts had proved them all wrong. Then came the call that would become legend. Winston Churchill personally telephoned Eisenhower. The British Prime Minister wanted details about Bastogne's relief. How had the Americans managed it? How had they moved so fast? "General Patton, sir," Eisenhower explained. He executed a 90-degree turn of his entire army and drove north to Bastogne in under a week. Churchill was silent for a long moment. Then, in that distinctive growling voice, Churchill said something that Eisenhower's staff would remember forever. According to witnesses in the room, according to documents declassified years later, according to historians who interviewed everyone present, Churchill said, "Good God. I always knew Patton was bold. I always knew he was brilliant. But I thought his reputation was somewhat American enthusiasm, shall we say. I was wrong. What George Patton accomplished is perhaps the greatest feat of military movement in this entire war. Tell General Patton that Great Britain salutes him. Tell him history will remember this." Then Churchill added, almost to himself, "Thank God he's on our side." Those words from Winston Churchill, Britain's war leader, a man who rarely praised anyone, lavishly cemented George Smith Patton's legend. When Churchill acknowledged your military genius, the debate was over. But Churchill wasn't done. In private, speaking to his personal secretary, Churchill reportedly said something even more revealing. According to John Colville's diary, discovered after Churchill's death, the Prime Minister whispered, "If we'd had Patton in France in 1940, Dunkirk might never have happened." That was the ultimate compliment. Churchill was admitting that General George Smith Patton, this American tank commander, might have been the difference between defeat and victory in Britain's darkest hour. The impact of George Smith Patton's achievement rippled across the Allied command structure and around the world. United States newspapers exploded with headlines, "Patton saves Bastogne." The American public, which had endured anxious days wondering if the German offensive would succeed, erupted in celebration. Patton became an instant national hero again. His face appeared on magazine covers. Radio shows dramatized the relief of Bastogne. Movie theaters showed newsreels of Third Army tanks rolling through Belgian snow. But the most significant reactions came from those who understood military operations. General Dwight David Eisenhower, in his official after-action report, wrote, "The Third Army's shift from the Saar to the Ardennes was one of the most brilliant operations of the war. That General Patton was able to concentrate his forces and mount a major attack in such a short time reflects the flexibility and fighting spirit of American soldiers and the tactical genius of their commander. That was Eisenhower's public statement. Privately, he told staff officers, "Patton's a pain in my ass half the time, but when the chips are down, there's nobody I'd rather have. He saved 10,000 paratroopers, probably saved our entire position in Belgium, and he did it by sheer force of will." British Field Marshal Bernard Law Montgomery, who had advocated caution, reluctantly admitted, "General Patton's maneuver was impressive." Coming from Montgomery, that grudging acknowledgement was practically a standing ovation. The captured German officers told the most revealing story. During interrogations, German commanders expressed genuine shock. "We did not believe the Americans capable of such mobility," one Panzer general stated. "We calculated they would need 2 weeks minimum to counterattack. General Patton did it in 4 days. This is why we lost. Not because of your numbers or equipment, but because of commanders like Patton who refused to accept limitations." Another German officer, a veteran of the Russian front, said, "I fought the Soviets at Stalingrad and Kursk. I saw Russian attacks that seemed unstoppable, but Patton's Third Army moved faster than anything I witnessed in Russia. He attacks with a speed that makes conventional defense impossible." Perhaps the most telling comment came from a captured colonel who'd fought in North Africa. "We knew about Patton from Tunisia and Sicily. We feared him. When we heard his Third Army was in Lorraine, far from the Ardennes, we were relieved." Then, impossibly, he appeared at Bastogne. "That was the moment I knew Germany would lose this war. You cannot defeat an enemy with commanders like Patton." The strategic significance extended beyond saving Bastogne. Hitler had gambled everything on the Ardennes offensive. He'd stripped the Eastern Front of reserves, pulled back divisions from other sectors, committed his last mobile forces to this one desperate thrust. When it failed, when George Smith Patton smashed through the southern flank and relieved Bastogne, Hitler lost his final chance to change the war's trajectory. Germany had 4 months left. 4 months of fighting, but the outcome was decided. The relief of Bastogne by Old Blood and Guts marked the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany. For the United States Army, Patton's achievement validated American military doctrine: mobility, aggression, combined arms warfare, and decentralized command. While European armies had spent centuries perfecting defensive operations and methodical advances, the United States military, led by commanders like George Smith Patton, had created a new way of war: fast, violent, overwhelming. Modern military scholars still study Patton's Bastogne maneuver in war colleges. The speed of movement, the logistics coordination, the maintenance of combat effectiveness during rapid redeployment, it's considered one of the textbook examples of operational art. Computer simulations, run decades later with modern technology, conclude that Patton's staff work was nearly optimal. They couldn't have done it much better with 21st century computers than Old Blood and Guts did with paper and telephones in 1944. So, what did Churchill really whisper when he heard Patton reached Bastogne first? According to those who were there, according to the historical record, Churchill expressed something that went beyond mere professional respect. He acknowledged that George Smith Patton represented a new kind of warfare: faster, more aggressive, less bound by conventional limitations. In that moment, Churchill recognized that the future of military command looked like Old Blood and Guts, not the careful, methodical generals of previous wars. This is why General George Smith Patton remains legendary. Not just because he won battles, many generals won battles. Not just because he commanded successfully, many did that too. George Smith Patton is legendary because, when faced with the impossible, when every expert said it couldn't be done, when cautious wisdom counseled delay, Old Blood and Guts said, "I'll do it in 3 days." And then he did. The relief of Bastogne crystallized everything that made Patton great. His tactical brilliance, recognizing that speed and surprise could overcome numerical disadvantage. His leadership inspiring soldiers to achieve what they thought impossible. His courage leading from the front, sharing every danger. His aggression, attacking when others wanted to defend. His will, refusing to accept defeat or delay. Those 10,000 paratroopers who walked out of Bastogne alive knew who saved them. The United States of America knew who turned the tide. History knows who made the difference. Today, when military commanders study mobile warfare, they study Patton. When they teach aggressive leadership, they teach Patton. When they discuss the human element in combat, the importance of will, courage, and determination, they reference old blood and guts. George Smith Patton proved that in war, human qualities still matter. Technology matters, numbers matter, logistics matter, but at the critical moment, when everything hangs in the balance, leadership makes the difference. One commander with vision, courage, and will can change the course of history. That's the real lesson of Bastogne. That's what Churchill recognized. That's why, 70+ years later, we still tell stories about General George Smith Patton. Because when everyone else saw impossible, old blood and guts saw opportunity. If this story of how George Smith Patton achieved the impossible moved you, hit subscribe. We're bringing you more untold moments from General George Smith Patton, history's greatest combat commander. Drop a comment about what makes old blood and guts legendary, and share this with anyone who needs to hear about true military genius. Thanks for watching. And remember, when they said it couldn't be done, when they said it would take weeks, when they said to wait for spring, General George Smith Patton said, 3 days and changed history. That's why they called him Old Blood and Guts.